Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. Really delighted to be able to introduce a good friend, Joshua Cape, who's visiting us here from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he's an assistant professor in statistics. Joshua did his PhD at Johns Hopkins and has had a variety of accolades, including a postdoc fellowship with the NSF. I learned that it's pronounced mouse-proof, MS Mathematical Sciences Postdoctoral Research Fellowship. And so Joshua does a lot of really interesting work and cutting-edge work on high-dimensional probability and various aspects of the mathematical foundations of data science, and then also on applications in natural sciences and social sciences. So with that, I will take it away.
Great. Thank you, David. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Apologies for the slight delay, but I promise we'll still get out on time. So my title is pretty broad for today, Advances in Dimensionality Reduction for Matrix Data. I'm going to zoom in pretty quickly on specific aspects of matrix data dimensionality reduction, but my hope is that this talk addresses both some big picture ideas and concepts, as well as some specifics and more concrete examples and results. So I know this audience is quite diverse in terms of training and background, so I'm hoping that there's at least a little something for everyone here. Please feel free to ask questions if you have them. I would much rather have this turn into a discussion in terms of answering questions rather than necessarily get through all the slides. So I mentioned dimensionality reduction in the title. There are a variety of tools that we could use for the purposes of dimensionality reduction. And really what I mean by dimensionality reduction is taking data which is inherently perhaps very complicated, messy, living in a high dimensional space, and somehow summarizing or reducing it into lower dimensions while capturing salient features of the overall data. We're going to focus in this talk on spectral methods for dimensionality reduction. And by spectral methods, what I mean are naturally methods based on matrices, their factorizations, truncations, and perturbations. If you've heard of the eigendecomposition, sometimes called the spectral decomposition, that's where spectral comes from here. It's not spectral domain, it has nothing to do with time series. We're thinking about matrices here in this talk. So eigenvalues, eigenvectors are going to be crucial for us today. More generally, a lot of what we're talking about extends relatively naturally to the discussion of singular values, singular vectors. If you've encountered unsupervised learning before, in particular, PCA, some manifold learning techniques, you'll see some connections to those domains. I'm going to talk a lot in this presentation about clustering, where the process of reducing dimension can allow you to infer unobserved cluster structure or patterns or latent geometry in your data. That's going to be one of the core themes here. If you're familiar with the concept of data denoising, that's a major theme in today's talk. And taking appropriate eigendecompositions, matrix factorizations, will have the effect of denoising our data. And as I just mentioned, clustering could be one problem that we're considering here. That can be extended more generally to latent space models, more interesting latent space geometry and structure. And I'll try to give just a brief illustration of that to motivate us here. If you're familiar with spectral clustering and spectral embedding, the idea is generally that we start with some data object, often in the form of a graph. So here, a collection of vertices, which are the points, a collection of edges, which are these line segments. And we convert the data into a matrix form. Okay, so here I'm showing you the connectivity matrix. It's a matrix of, well, zeros and ones. The zeros are white spaces, but ones simply indicate if two corresponding nodes have an edge or not. And so here, the rows and the columns of this matrix index the nodes. And I'm not showing you them here because they're not important for this example, but we have nodes 1, 2, 3, 4. We see an edge between nodes 1 and 2 here, for example, giving us a value 1 in this connectivity matrix, also called an adjacency matrix. So we've gone now to the setting where we have a possibly large connectivity matrix. We might want to do dimensionality reduction. In this talk, dimensionality reduction will correspond to an decomposition, in particular a truncated eigendecomposition, where now I'm taking this large n by n matrix and I'm computing just an n by 2 matrix. These are giving me the leading 2 eigenvectors for this matrix. And now if I look at the rows of this tall skinny matrix, the rows give me vectors in low dimensional Euclidean space. So these points now correspond to rows, which correspond to nodes in the original graph. Now, once I have my dimension-reduced data in Euclidean space, I can apply a variety of tools, algorithms, and methods. I could, for example, apply k-means or some other clustering method, which I've done here to show red versus blue points in low dimensional space. And now if I want to go all the way back to the original graph, I can color the nodes in the graph by the corresponding color that their embedding vector gets in Euclidean space. So this is an example of dimensionality reduction for matrix data. And one of the goals of this talk and some of the work that I've been doing is to really understand spectral clustering embedding at a very deep level, both sort of what algorithms work in practice, but also what algorithms are well motivated by quantifying theoretical guarantees in certain statistical models. And we'll make that more concrete in a little bit later. So I first got interested in the idea of dimension reduction in matrix data about 10 years ago, back in my PhD. At that time, my PhD advisors were collaborating with some folks at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. And they were studying fruit flies, so Drosophila in particular, fruit flies in their larval stage, and trying to understand memory and learning in fruit flies. Right? Now, fruit flies are perhaps intuitively a very sort of simple organism. And what's convenient about that is that neuroscientists actually at this stage have gone in and completely mapped out the wire diagram associated with memory and learning in fruit flies. So from those data, we can construct graphs or networks where the vertices or the points are neurons and the connections or the synapses between them represent the edges. And so in this work, they were interested in doing some exploratory data analysis. And so we have information about all the connections between particular neurons. We know in particular which direction they connect to each other in. There's some neurobiological meaning there. But what's interesting perhaps is that we can get matrix representations of the data. We can do some dimensionality reduction. Okay, so now we've reduced the dimension into just this 2-dimensional snapshot here. And we observe maybe some interesting structure here, right? It's not simply a line segment or not simply 2 clusters of tightly clustered data. We have something a little bit more interesting. In consultation with the neuroscientists, what my PhD advisors and their collaborators were able to identify is that, well, actually there is some cluster structure here that's associated to the neuron types. Again, in this example, we actually know which neuron belongs to which type in these data. But beyond clustering, there's actually this sort of parabolic line segment, or this curved line segment here in our lower dimensional latent space, all corresponding roughly to Kenyan cell neurons. And what's interesting is that actually the location along this trajectory corresponds closely to the age of that neuron. So it's not simply distinguishing between neuron types, but actually age being reflected in this summary of the data, which itself were very sort of high dimensional. I mean, some pre-processing went in, and yet we're able to discover something with a very clear neuroscientific significance and interpretation. And so at the time, I got very excited by this and sort of thought there must be a lot to do here, both on the real data side and also on the theory and methods. So that's really what led me in this direction.
Joshua, a quick question. So please. So that's really interesting. So I mean, is there a sense also biologically that sort of there's a I forget which one was the young side, but like, is it that like young KC neurons are going to tend to be more connected to MS or MBIN, and then as they age, they're going to tend to be more connected to.
That's a great question. Yeah, off the top of my head, I'm not quite sure about that. And closeness in latent space here might indicate similarity, but I mean certainly these are all different in kind neurons. So that's something that would have to be investigated in more detail. Yeah, but that's an excellent question. Okay, so in order to present some methods with theoretical guarantees, let's first take classical results in matrix algebra, statistics, machine learning as sort of our benchmarks, just to set the stage. And the first benchmark that I want to mention here is that of low-rank approximations via the singular value decomposition. So we have a theorem, perhaps familiar to some of us here, which says if you have a matrix, real valued rectangular, the matrix constructed by the leading R singular values and singular vectors of A minimizes the Frobenius difference between A and all matrices B that are the same dimension and have the rank constraint, rank equal to R. Okay? So in other words, the closest matrix to an input matrix subject to this rank constraint in Frobenius norm is just a truncation of the original matrix. Okay? Here stated in the Frobenius norm, this result has been extended and is known in other cases as well. It holds for all unitarily invariant norms. In particular, it also holds for operators in the infinite dimensional regime. One thing to point out here, though, is that this result is deterministic in the sense that there's no randomness here. It's unstructured in the sense that A doesn't have any particular form. We're just working with its SVD, right? All rectangular matrices have an SVD. We haven't said anything about low rank sparse structure. And we're working with here the Frobenius norm. Okay? Remember, the Frobenius norm is just based on sum of squared differences. Right? And the Frobenius norm captures an overall measure of closeness. Overall in the sense that it's summing over all discrepancies between A and B. That's giving us sort of a coarse, high-level understanding of the matrix, not necessarily an in-depth view of how close are the individual entries themselves. So this is one benchmark result for today. The other is that of aligning matrices or subspaces using what are called Procrustes rotations. Okay? Very similar in kind to the example we just saw, but here we have two input matrices, rectangular of the same size, with full column rank, and we're going to ask how close can we make these input matrices A and B to each other if we allow an orthogonal transformation to act on one of the matrices here. So we again are looking at a minimization problem, but now over orthogonal matrices W that are n by n. Visually, the way to think about this is that the rows of A and B are vectors in Euclidean space. So pretend they're my fingertips, okay? So the rows of A are on this hand, the rows of B are on this hand, and I'm asking what is the best way to align these two matrices subject to an orthogonal transformation, which in this case would correspond to rotating one of my wrists. So trying to get my fingers to match up perfectly by only rotating one of my wrists, not actually moving my fingers closer or farther apart. It turns out that we can solve this problem in Frobenius norm very nicely and explicitly by computing an explicit minimizer, W star, using the original matrices B and A themselves and computing an SVD and keeping the left and the right orthogonal factors from that. In the case when A and B themselves are more structured, if they're representing bases for low dimensional subspaces, in the orthonormal, that reduces to subspace distances. But again, as with the previous slide, this theorem is deterministic, so there's no randomness, right? It's unstructured in the sense that A and B are just two matrices. I mean, having full column rank is a very weak statement. And it's again in Frobenius norm, right? So it's an overall sort of coarse expression of the closeness of these two matrices. Okay, and so in today's talk, I want to go beyond deterministic to certain stochastic settings. I want to go beyond unstructured to structured problems that are well motivated by statistical models. And I want to go beyond the Frobenius norm because I want to understand this closeness at a more refined level of granularity. So this talk is really a collection of bits and pieces from a few different papers. So I've been thinking about this for quite a while. But here I'm just highlighting some of the keywords from the paper titles, which I hope you'll leave today having some impression of. The first is going to be that we're going to work with a particular norm, the so-called 2 to infinity norm. We'll introduce that in just a moment. We're going to talk about eigenvector deviations and fluctuations. We saw on the spectral clustering slide that we computed a matrix of leading 2 eigenvectors, right? So we saw that already. I'm going to introduce a network model called stochastic block model as a very simple but yet rich stochastic model for networks that lets us really understand dimensionality reduction at a deep level using spectral methods. Okay, and that really gets at this final point here, spectral methods for dimensionality reduction. All of these are already published and available, so everything on the slides is basically complementary to these. Okay, so let's now zoom in and become a little bit more concrete about the matrices that we're considering. Okay, so for simplicity, we're going to consider symmetric matrices. We can extend to the asymmetric case, but it really is just much simpler to present it for symmetric matrices. So we are going to consider a so-called signal plus noise matrix framework. By that, I mean we observe a matrix M hat, which consists of an unobserved signal matrix perturbed by an unobserved noise matrix. Neither of these are observed individually. We are going to imbue them with some structure, and our goal will finally be to quantify the extent to which properties of M hat reflect properties of M. Whoops. We are going to work with a low rank or an approximately low rank assumption at the population level, meaning that for this matrix M, this signal matrix, it's going to have a spectral gap, meaning that some, say the top R eigenvalues will be larger in magnitude than the remainder. And what this does is this allows us to write our matrix M in this block form where we have a spike or sort of a dominant part of the signal, and the bulk is sort of a residual part of the signal, if you will. We're going to put hats on all of the sample quantities. Remember, hats are things that we can actually observe or compute. And so now our goal for part of this talk will be to quantify how close the sample eigenvectors are to the population eigenvectors. And I put approximately here because we're going to have to be a little bit careful when we define the notion of distance between these. These are both orthonormal matrices, meaning their columns have unit norm and they are orthogonal to each other. And in this quest of studying deviations and fluctuations, we want to obtain uniform entrywise error bounds, which give us a more refined control over the difference between these matrices beyond what the Frobenius norm can do, for example. So this is really allowing us to zoom in and say something uniformly across the entire rows. Any questions at this point about the setup here? So low rank symmetric matrices, right? That's basically the few word summary here, but with a little bit of notation structure. Okay. So let's go back to this idea of spectral clustering and networks just to make this a little bit more concrete. So I'm giving you a concrete graph on 6 nodes. I'm giving you the corresponding adjacency matrix for this. Okay, there's nothing random here, but now suppose that this is an instantiation from a random graph model where the random graph model has this matrix P, which gives us the probability of there being an edge between nodes I and J. In this case, so A is going to be decomposed as its expectation plus A minus its expectation. So this might look a little weird here. We're just adding and subtracting expectation of A, but that's just because the signal is given here, and the noise is implicit in the difference between the observation and the population. So now, if we posit such a model where the expectation of A has low rank block structure, then we're putting this example into the language of the previous slide. So this is our M matrix now, right? These are our U vectors up to scaling, our eigenvectors. And what we see with the second leading eigenvector is that the first three nodes are distinguished from the second three nodes on the basis of a sign flip, plus minus 1. That location of a sign flip is conveying the block structure here. It's distinguishing nodes in the first block or community, if you will, from nodes in the second block or community. And so here what this matrix is saying is node entry ij gives you the probability that node I and j form an edge. So we have all p's here, we have all q's here, meaning all nodes within the same block have probability p of connecting with each other. And nodes in different communities have a different probability. So now what we would like to say is that the second eigenvector of our data is approximately the second eigenvector here, which we don't see. If it is close enough, then that means we're picking up a discrepancy on the basis of signs, which lets us then cluster the nodes in the graph. Okay, so this is trying to make the spectral clustering schematic a little bit more concrete here, and trying to convince you that there is meaningful structure potentially in eigenvectors. So it really makes sense that we want to understand estimating them. Okay, so to study this formally, we're going to consider this matrix difference U hat minus UW. Right? We saw ABW just a few slides ago, and I gave you this illustration with my fingertips. That's exactly what's happening here. Only now we can more concretely see the rows representing our nodes in low dimensional space. So we're interested in this difference. The reason we're keeping W here rather than just dropping it is that when we compute eigenvectors, there is a sign flip ambiguity, right, plus minus 1, as well as if you have repeated eigenvalues, then you have a subspace non-identifiability. And so that's why to make the notion of distance precise, we have to capture W here. So that's really going back to this previous slide and being careful about approximately in this statement. So we're going to study the matrix difference here. Okay. And we're going to study it with what's called the 2 to infinity norm. Okay, and it has this name because it can be represented as this mixed norm on matrices that involves a soup over the Euclidean ball, so L2 for vectors, and an L infinity vector norm on Tx. Okay. Now, what the heck is this thing? Well, at first blush, it's not immediately clear, but with a little bit of work, we can check that this is simply the maximum Euclidean row norm of our matrix. So we're just computing the L2 norm for all the rows, and we're looking at the largest one. I'm using T to represent U hat minus UW because we want to think of matrices that are tall and skinny. Okay? It's tall because our ambient data are in a large dimensional space. We have n nodes where n might be large, but it's skinny because we're reducing dimensionality into only a few dimensions. So in our previous examples, the dimension was 2. Right? We went from n by n matrices to n by 2. So it's tall and skinny. And actually the size of the matrices is important for choosing an appropriate norm to work with. So just equivalently, I'm going to use this a little bit later in the talk just because the notation with this arrow is sometimes annoying. It's simply the maximum over all L2 norms computed for the rows. The advantage for using this norm rather than the Frobenius norm or operator norm is that for exactly tall, skinny matrices, the max Euclidean row norm is roughly the same size as the entrywise, max entrywise norm. And I say approximately in the sense that these norms can be related to each other as a function of the number of columns, whereas Remember, this matrix is tall and skinny, so the rows are much larger than the columns. The operator norm, the Frobenius norm are always going to be close. I mean, this is going to be a low rank matrix, so we know that they're going to be close, but there can be a potential gap between the 2 to infinity norm and the operator norm when the rows are large. And what this means is that if we can take the matrix of interest and study it directly in this norm and decompose it and study it a little bit more carefully, then we can possibly obtain much stronger bounds directly on the 2 to infinity norm than if we just bound the Frobenius norm and use that as a trivial upper bound for the 2 to infinity norm. And so to summarize that partially, what I'm saying here is that possibly the 2 to infinity norm or even the max absolute entry norm can go to 0, even if when you aggregate the elements by taking something like a Frobenius norm, even if this is stable or it's self-diverging. So now we're really saying something uniform over all rows and at a more refined level of granularity, really zooming in to the structure of the matrix. So if you've encountered principal component analysis, then you'll have seen, eigenvectors and eigenvalues have a very clear interpretation in terms of the coefficients, right, and the variances when you're working with the sample covariance matrix. There's some very classical results in multivariate statistics about how well your sample eigenvectors estimate your population eigenvectors in the classical regime where your sample size increases but your dimensionality is fixed. Under assumptions like distinct population eigenvalues. The ideas in this talk can be and have been applied to covariance matrix type problems. I won't talk about them in detail in this talk, but I wanted to give just one slide to mention that this is the case. And we can actually study covariance matrices as signal plus noise models, where the noise or the residual becomes a little bit more difficult to work with, but it's still possible to do that. And various people in the literature have studied the analogous extensions of this model to the case when you have a large dimensional problem, right? When you have P, your number of covariates or features being large or growing, as well as under structural assumptions like you have repeated population eigenvalues. So if you're interested in covariance matrix estimation, I can point you to some references that might be of interest if you're curious how these ideas extend in that domain. Okay, so I was in some ways fortunate, I would say, because right around the time I was thinking of matrices and dimension reduction, there was a surge in research interest within statistics, computer science, engineering for sort of similar or adjacent ideas. This was back in 2015, 2016, 2017. And so this slide is just designed to, well, this is a slide where in chronological order appearing on archive, we have top to bottom. But then in statistics, there's a very large lag with journal publication. And so I'm giving you the final year of the publication here, right? So a paper, yes, that's right. So even if a paper appears on archive after a previous paper, it could actually be published first and vice versa. And so there's been a large variety of interest in these problems. As someone in a statistics department, I'm sort of biasing my discussion to more of the statistical and theoretical computer science contributions here. These are just a few of them, and I'm just sort of highlighting some of the paper titles that I alluded to previously. So really going back to 2016 and 17, papers started appearing in 2018, and they've been, more and more papers have come up ever since, to the point where there's actually now a book that you can download for free or buy. The book is called Spectral Methods for Data Science, a Statistical Perspective. This is published, written by Yuqin Chen and his co-authors. A lovely, lovely book. It lets you start with sort of matrix foundations, perturbation theory. It lets you see classical results for Frobenius norm bounds, operator norm bounds, and then it goes into detail pertaining to some of the results I'm covering here today, namely row-wise and entry-wise bounds. So for more on this, I'd highly encourage you to look. This is sort of a second generation result, if you will. citing the previous works and the many others that have come out recently. So it's really quite a lot. But that means there's a lot of fun work to be done. So no room for boredom. Okay, so going back to this picture, in the remaining time with you, I want to describe some details for how to do spectral clustering and what guarantees you can get for stochastic block model graphs, right? So I'm going to impose a model for graphs. That's going to lead to randomness in our sample eigenvectors, and that's going to lead to being able to prove concentration inequalities and asymptotic distributional results for our sample quantities against the population. Okay, so stochastic block models are simple models for graphs in which every node in the graph belongs to one of a fixed number of communities, typically fixed. Nodes' connectivity patterns are only determined by the memberships of the different nodes. So an example would be, I'm at University of Wisconsin, David Hong is here, and so maybe so my connectivity with him would only be driven by the fact that we are at different universities, and for the Wisconsin-Delaware connection, there's a particular probability associated with that. Okay. So in captivity, or a simulated example would be something like this in practice, where we don't observe the block structure, like we don't observe university affiliation or something like this, and we would like to recover it. And here I'm showing you the population level, just like the color, well, unlike the previous slide where we colored the nodes after applying an algorithm, here I'm saying this is the ground truth, and we're going to try to recover this ground truth up to a permutation. So a little bit of notation. We're going to have a vector pi giving us the block memberships, right? So every vertex or node gets assigned to a block, right? And we're going to do that by sampling memberships for each node. So each node has a tau I generated categorical, and pi L is just the probability that node I belongs to category L. So we're going to do that at the very beginning. That gives us our memberships. And now conditioned on the memberships, we're going to generate random adjacency matrices where the probability that nodes I and J have an edge is given by looking at the corresponding entry in B for the community of node I and the community of node J, and including rho as what's called a sparsity factor. The sparsity factor is here because in many network settings with asymptotics, as the graph grows, the problem becomes easier. So if simultaneously probabilities or connectivities go to zero as the graph grows, then we can sort of adjust or tune the complexity or difficulty of the problem. So this rho is really more for theoretical interest, but it's not going to play a major role. It will influence the results that we can get, but really our key parameters of interest are B, this K by K symmetric matrix of probabilities, and this vector pi. Let me pause for a moment. Yes, questions, please.
Yeah, so why the memberships are stochastic? So basically, I think they should be deterministic according to like the real membership community structure.
Great. So that's an excellent question. So in this talk, I'm assuming this setup, but it is absolutely true that in the literature and in some other situations, we don't prescribe a mechanism here. We simply say the nodes have block memberships. They are fixed. We don't know them, and then that gives us a deterministic membership matrix, right? There's very little difference between that distinction in the literature, but you're right that there is technically a distinction. Thank you. Any other questions about the setting?
Maybe related to that, for the results you're going to show, how important is it for that to be random versus
in our case? It doesn't matter, and it doesn't matter because we're going to have sufficient homogeneity in the sense that, well, for deterministic results, the quality of your results depends on proportion of memberships. So if you have one community that's collapsing, that causes a problem because you're sort of losing information asymptotically. You might never get information about that community. But in the models that are studied in the literature and in this talk, we have stability. So we're not going to worry about situations like that. But it's an excellent question. To be clear, we're not assuming that nodes, so either in the deterministic case or here, we're not assuming that all the nodes, exactly half are in one block and half are in another, right? But the proportions are stable. Okay, so if you're familiar with stochastic block models, you'll be familiar with their limitations. There are certainly more.
I'm Siri. What can I do for you?
Hey Siri, do you have a question? So you can go beyond stochastic block models in some settings, but it really is a convenient baseline that is still sufficiently rich to understand sort of the theory and methods. Okay, so here is a simplified version of a theorem. I don't want you to look or think too much about exactly all the sort of the notation here. I mean, we've seen it all before, but really the punchline is for graphs that are not too sparse, you can control the 2 to infinity norm distance. So that's the max Euclidean norm distance between your sample eigenvectors and the population eigenvectors explicitly in a way that captures the size of the matrix and that captures the sparsity pattern here. What's important about this result is that we have both a 1/√n factor and another factor that's going to 0. For this expression, the population eigenvectors are themselves already decaying to 0 entrywise. They are what's called delocalized. So it's not enough for our bound to go to 0. It has to go to 0 fast enough in order to be able to guarantee that we're perfectly clustering all the nodes. So red denotes that this is something we need in order for the result to potentially be useful, and blue is the factor that gives us convergence to 0 faster than order 1/√n. And by getting faster convergence to 0, what we're saying with this result is that asymptotically, so for large graphs with high probability, each node is perfectly clustered or recovering the underlying membership vector given by the population level, right? So again, my fingertips here, what we're saying is that asymptotically, I have more and more fingers. Okay, so I can't really grow fingers now in front of you. But in addition to growing fingers, my fingertips for my corresponding fingers are getting closer and closer uniformly, right? The entire collection of fingertips is getting closer. So that's what this result is saying. So this is a very strong result about spectral clustering for stochastic block models. So, if you were to apply a clustering algorithm like K-means or Gaussian mixture modeling to your sample eigenvectors, then, this result is in some sense saying, like, you're guaranteed to get closer and closer to the truth. And since your blocks are separated in low dimensional space, you'll eventually get perfect clustering. And you can see this if you simulate stochastic block model graphs in configurations that satisfy the assumptions. Please.
So it's also based on the spectral clustering method. So basically the improvement from the Frobenius norm to like a 2 infinity norm with no cost, right?
Okay, so excellent question. I want to make a slight distinction here. This is simply a perturbation argument. So I'm not actually applying a clustering algorithm. I'm not actually studying the statistical properties of a clustering algorithm. But in practice and simulation, if you apply one, it'll be successful. You can specify an algorithm directly and show that it will perfectly cluster using spectral clustering. Right? The most common one is approximate K-means clustering, going back to Lay and Ronaldo in 2015. But that was for the Frobenius norm case. Please.
Technical question. So at the top, you provided the order of n row.
Yeah.
Is that so that's a condition for the statement to hold, or are you saying that to say that the second term is O1?
So this result holds for sparse, but not too sparse graphs.
Oh, so
If your graph becomes too sparse, it becomes impossible to cluster. I mean, fundamentally, because if your graph is too sparse, you're going to lose connectivity. Right? Your graph is going to be disconnected with overwhelming probability in the limit. And so this is saying we're sparse, but not too sparse. maybe I'll also mention that everywhere you see log factors in this talk, they're not necessarily optimal. Right? So this 2 here, using a different proof technique, another approach, and other authors have studied this as well, it can actually be reduced. So it's just log. But great questions. Okay, so that was a result for consistency or deviation, right? How close are the sample eigenvectors to the population eigenvectors? This is a statement about asymptotic normality for that difference. So now fix, say, the first node in your graph, and think about a sequence of graphs from stochastic block model. What can you say about the residual of that node to the population eigenvectors? And so we have a result here. It's a little bit complicated, but it says ultimately that there is asymptotic normality in low dimensional space for stochastic block models, where the asymptotic mean is 0, so we're asymptotically unbiased, and the covariance depends on the block membership. So just to see a quick little simulation, this is an embedding for a 2-block stochastic block model. The true centroids are located roughly here. I've colored the vectors based on the true membership. I'm showing both population level contours for this theorem, as well as just the empirical 95% contours here. So the dashed lines, right, blue, they're close. I mean, they're not exactly on the solid black lines, but this is for a relatively small graph. I think there are only 200 nodes here, right? So what we're seeing is elliptic structure. We're seeing that the red nodes behave different from the red points behave different from the blue points, right? And that's illustrating the fact that we have different covariances and different Gaussian components for each cluster. And this you can, yeah. So with this result, what we've done is address both deviations and fluctuations concerning the properties of sample eigenvectors. Okay. Now, as a statistician, I'm trained to think about estimation, where there are some parameters of interest in a model that I'd like to estimate. Clustering involves memberships, which are part of the model, but they're not exactly parameters per se. In the block model, our parameter of interest is really a parameter matrix. It's this matrix B. Remember, B is the matrix of connectivity probabilities. And B here, expressed sort of in color 2 by 2. So this is really a matrix of probabilities that we're interested in estimating, where the expectation of A, given the membership, has block structure. If we arrange the blocks so that all nodes of the same type appear here, all nodes of the next type appear here, this is a block dilation of the B matrix. And this black-white rectangular matrix on both sides, this is just encoding the memberships, right? So think of these as standard basis vectors. We have 1, 0. These are all 1 zeros, and these are 0 1s, right? Distinguishing block 1 from block 2 here. So now our goal will be for this model to propose spectral estimators for B and actually Z itself, rather than U. U, the matrix of eigenvectors, is, I mean, it's related to the matrix here, the expectation of A, but it's not really parameterizing it per se. It's really, we're specifying A through Z and B. So we would like to study these, and then with time permitting, compare them to how likelihood-based methods in part of our investigations, when we have this matrix of parameters B, there's an interesting question we can ask. So in contrast to the current setting, when we're talking about parameters, usually we think about a vector or just a collection of parameters where there's not really a correspondence between the parameters in any concrete way. But here our parameters are populating a matrix, right? It's a K by K matrix. Matrices have structure, in particular matrices have rank, right? And so a novel question in some of this work that we ask is, well, what about the case when the rank of B is strictly less than the number of communities? Here's an example. If we take the vector P comma Q and take the outer product with itself, that gives us a B matrix. So this is a 2x2 matrix. There are two communities, but it's only rank 1. Whereas in general, if we have a 2x2 matrix, well, we could have rank either 1 or 2, right? Excluding the null case. It turns out that actually the rank of B matters in a very concrete statistical sense for estimation. And one way to maybe think about that is that the statistical complexity of the problem that we're studying may depend on the rank, because a rank constraint on a matrix constrains the configurations of the entries, right? You can't have arbitrary sort of probability values here under a rank constraint. And so what that means is if we take B and if we take this eigendecomposition of B and we parameterize it through its eigendecomposition, then we can count the number of parameters the number of free parameters in UB and lambda B. And that expression given here is always less than or equal to the naive number of parameters, which is just the number of strictly upper triangular and diagonal elements of B. So when D is much smaller than K, blue and red are potentially much different, and therefore the complexity of the problem and estimation may be impacted significantly. So we propose a very simple to write down, but ultimately difficult to analyze estimator for B. The idea is the following. We're going to estimate the rank of B from our adjacency matrix. And we can actually do this consistently by just taking a scree plot and looking at the eigenvalues that way. So we'll get an estimate, but I'm going to work with the true dimensionality D, so just assume you know it for simplicity. We're going to compute the matrix of leading eigenvectors, okay? Just like we've been talking about in this talk. We're going to cluster U hat, just like we've been talking about, to get estimated memberships. And then we're going to go back to the truncated eigendecomposition of A, and we're going to form our estimator just by averaging over all elements in the blocks given to us by the estimated cluster. Right? So we have our adjacency matrix, we have its low rank truncation. Its low rank truncation, if we were to reorder it, has block structure, and we're just averaging over the block structure. And that gives us an estimator, a spectral estimator for the k-elfth entry of B. This is nice. This allows us to sort of start with A, take a truncated eigendecomposition, but we never actually have to go back to the original graph. We never have to go back and see, was there actually an edge between node I and J? This is very appealing.
Is the sparsity parameter known, or you need to estimate?
Great question. It's known. That's right. The issue with estimating sparsity, or trying to estimate sparsity, is that for fixed n, so for a fixed graph, fixed, like individual graphs live in multiple sparsity regimes, right? And so there's a non-identifiability with respect to sparsity that you have to be careful of. So virtually all results in the statistics literature have to, in some sense, assume sparsity is known. In practice, you can get proxies for it, but for the theory, we assume it's known. Please.
So steps 4 and 5 together, does that correspond to a, let's see. And I want to somehow say that somehow once I've clustered the rows, maybe then I try to project onto the set of corresponding, matrices with the corresponding structure.
Well, you're kind of projecting A onto its leading eigenspace, which just gives you the low rank truncation.
Right. So there's sort of two stages of projection here, right? There's projection onto the set of rank D hat matrices, and then the second projection, which is sort of onto the set of matrices with the appropriate something like.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I wouldn't call this a projection. The first step is this is just aggregating over elements of that, and then defining an estimator entrywise.
So if you blow it up, does it not correspond to a kind of a projection in the Frobenius sense or something like that?
Okay, so yes, you could maybe argue it that way. Yeah.
Thanks.
Good questions. I mentioned denoising at the beginning of the talk. And one way to sort of see that briefly in math notation is that the low rank truncation of A, which I'm denoting by P hat, can be closer to the ground truth P, so here the expectation, closer than the original data matrix A. And this can be quantified in concentration, both in Frobenius norm here and in max absolute entry norm, right? So A is close to expected A, but actually the truncated A is closer to expected A in both of these ways. So that has the effect of denoising the data that you observe. And the denoising here is possible because your signal strength in your low rank matrix is sufficiently strong for you to be able to recover. Okay. So we have some results that tell us how well we can estimate the true probabilities BKL here. We have asymptotic normality results that basically say our spectral estimators are asymptotically normal about the true probability. But then, depending on if the matrix is full rank or not, the matrix B, there's possibly asymptotic bias terms that start to appear. Okay. In the case when B is full rank, this term vanishes, and we just have asymptotic normality where where asymptotically means zero. There's nothing here. But this bias term is actually sort of very interesting and was not known and appreciated in the literature sort of prior to some of this work. Turns out that if we compare our asymptotic normality result to the case when you do likelihood-based estimation for the B matrix, in which there's also an asymptotic normality result, our variance is the same. So in that sense, we're asymptotically efficient in the full rank case. In the sparse case, the story is similar, but a little bit more complicated. The rates change, and this is actually interesting because you're reducing variability by taking a low rank truncation, but you're actually inducing more and more bias. So there's the cost is in the bias. So actually, if we multiply this out by this term, the bias is actually blowing up. So we need this growing bias to stabilize to give us asymptotic normality. And again, these results hold for moderately sparse, but not too sparse graphs. Okay. We can further study, we can compare our asymptotic normality results to asymptotic normality results that don't assume any knowledge of the rank of B, what are called naive likelihood-based methods, and a true likelihood-based method that accounts for the rank of B when B in fact has rank equal to D. And so there are three estimators that we could consider: red, orange, and ours blue. And in the Bernoulli paper, we look at the ratio of mean squared error for these different estimators, and we find, quite interestingly, that spectral outperforms the naive, so the unconstrained likelihood-based estimation, outperforms on the basis of asymptotic variance, and is only slightly worse than the rank constraint. And we have to be worse, or we have to be no better than the rank constrained, because the rank constrained likelihood is taking it into account. What's nice is that we're not too much different. So I guess these contours are not visible for people in the back, but what's important here is that these plots are not simply one color. These are not solid, right? There's some interesting stratification and coloring in these contours. So neither dominates. That's right, neither spectral nor the naive dominate. It outperforms, it often outperforms. Okay. All right. We can go a step further, as I promised, beyond estimating B to estimating Z, okay? The way to do that is actually rather deep and is only possible sort of through recent advances, actually by other folks at Wisconsin, studying what are called Verimax factor rotations. The idea is to take a configuration of points like we have here and to rotate them in a way that promotes sparsity, meaning that points align with the coordinate axes. So perhaps you'll agree that this panel of points, where we see these black points, this is less sparse than this panel, where the points are rotated to be strongly along the red coordinate axis. Okay, and it's through the study of Varimax factor rotations that we can actually talk about estimating the matrix Z here of block memberships as a matrix, and we can talk about estimating it in the 2 to infinity norm sense, right? In the max Euclidean row norm sense. And so for this, recently, I published a result that gives the corresponding asymptotic normality statements when we're interested in estimating the membership matrix rather than the matrix of eigenvectors. What's interesting in this setup is that we have both data sparsity and latent variable sparsity. So like the adjacency matrix can be sparse in the sense that there are many zeros compared to ones, and the block model structure is sparse in the sense that our latent memberships are sparse. We have zeros and ones. So that's quite interesting. Here's a visual example of sort of what's going on after they've been rotated. So here in this left column, they've been rotated, but you see that their centroids are still close to the coordinate axes. So this is not as pretty as the previous plot. That's because the previous plot looks more like a degree-corrected stochastic block model, and we see sort of very nice alignment along the coordinate axes here. Okay, so to recap this most recent part of the talk, I'd like to convey to you that stochastic block models provide a somewhat simple but perhaps also surprisingly rich landscape for us to study dimensionality reduction using spectral methods. Spectral methods are used all over the place, but historically they were reserved for exploratory data analysis. They can in fact be used beyond that and for inference. There are some interesting historical connections here with recently published papers and the resurgence of Varimax. There's some interesting connections to sparse latent factor models and stochastic block models. And in practice, data are not exactly block structured, but often approximate block structure is enough of a starting point to sort of pursue more sophisticated problems. So with that, I think I'll end it there, and thank you so much. Please.
Joshua, thanks so much for your nice talk. Yeah, I really learned a lot. Yeah. Also, I have one question. So basically, the L2 to infinity error bound, it's we can derive such a result simply because we have a noise perturbation, something like that, right? So basically, if we don't have noise, we don't have this kind of error bound for the SVD spectral method, right? I'm not sure why.
You said if we don't have noise, we don't have an error bound.
We have the Frobenius norm error bound, classical result.
So if there's no noise, then what do you say? What is close to what? That's the question.
Okay, so basically close to maybe approximate low rank matrix.
Oh, so are you thinking that we have an input matrix and its low rank part is the signal and the non-low rank part is somehow?
Yeah, maybe I ask a silly question, so sorry about that. Yeah. Yeah, maybe it's also noise. Yeah, you're right.
Okay. Yeah. I guess maybe one way to rephrase your question is, we've been talking a lot about like M or matrices with a hat versus matrices without a hat, right? And there's some correspondence between them. We're talking about eigenvectors, so it's those matrices, it's a little more complicated than just additive noise. But it turns out that when you start with additive noise, it actually has a roughly linear impact on the leading eigenvectors. And that is what we can exploit for the bounds. Yeah, thank you. Please.
Could you go to page 14?
14?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, just a simple question. Is there any intuitive explanation why the row space of the leading eigenvector is so effective in telling you the underlying clustering?
Excellent question. So the one phrase answer is spectral graph theory. But let me elaborate briefly. So here I'm talking about a connectivity or an adjacency matrix. A lot of spectral clustering is often introduced through graph Laplacians. Okay, if you work with graph Laplacians, then you can show, it depends on how you define the Laplacian, but for the Laplacian, you have small eigenvalues indicating cluster structure, and the eigenvectors are flat on clusters. Essentially, they're indicating which cluster you belong to. So if you have a graph consisting of k connected components, your k eigenvectors for your Laplacian will recover those connected components for you. And those ideas extend to some extent to the adjacency consideration here. Although it's much easier to prove and work with adjacency matrices in this setting than graph Laplacians.
Maybe with that, we'll end here. And if there's other questions folks want to discuss, come up, and I think Josh will be here up front for a few minutes, and then before we head to lunch. So with that, let's thank our speaker again.
Thank you.